and I will be sending you an email after the webinar to let you know how you could access that recording. So I think it's probably a good time to start the webinar. It's 1 o'clock on the Pacific Coast and 4 o'clock on the East Coast. My name is Bora Simmons, and we're going to be speaking today about the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education and one of the particular pieces of that project. This is an initiative of the North American Association for Environmental Education. And to get started, I just wanted to have each of the presenters introduce themselves, just so that you as the participants have a chance to hear our voices and put a connection between our voices and our faces, as it were. And then as we go through the webinar, you'll be hearing us. As I said, I am Bora Simmons. I'm the director of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education, and I'm based out of Eugene, Oregon. Ed?
I'm Ed McCrae. I'd like to say hello to everyone that's on board. I'm the president of Environmental Education and Conservation Global, a nonprofit organization that does training in social marketing and applied environmental education internationally, particularly in developing countries such as India and Thailand. Before that, I was executive director of NAAEE, and I worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service in education, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in education for many years. I worked with Laura when the idea of guidelines first came up. We initiated the project for NAAE, and I've served as the team writer for a couple of the guidelines, including this one, the non-formal guidelines. Bill?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Seaman. I'm on the faculty at the University of Florida, and even though I'm retired, I'm still active. My background is aquatic sciences and fisheries with research in coastal habitats. I've also worked in the Sea Grant program in Florida in outreach and grants administration and in marine education with 4-H and other non-formal audiences. And currently my wife and I are in western North Carolina in the mountains, and Bora, all I can say is that at this time a year ago, I had no idea I'd be participating in a webinar, so thank you.
Certainly. What I wanted to give the participants was just a very quick tour of the Adobe Connect site so that you know how to access us. And some folks have already figured out that you can use the chat function. And there's a couple of messages there that Ed is coming in a little bit low in terms of volume, so maybe we'll ask him to speak up when it gets to his turn again. For those of you looking at that chat function, you can leave messages that go out to the whole group, or if you want to send a private message to one of the presenters or one of the other participants, all you have to do is roll your cursor over that person's name. There should be a little pop-up box that comes up, and then it'll say start private chat, and you can send a chat message to a specific individual. One of the other things that I wanted to point out to you was that up on the top of your screen there's a black ribbon, and there should be a little icon of an individual with their hand raised. And with that, you can raise your hand, you can ask for us to speak louder or a little bit more slowly if we're breaking up. All of this is done with voice over internet protocols, so I realize depending on the speed of your internet connection, sometimes we have a little bit of problem. So with that as an opening bit about the Adobe Connect and how you can interact with it, I wanted to ask participants if you could just give us an indication of whether or not you've participated in any of the previous webinars that we've held on the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. This is, in fact, our 5th in the series, and there will be a 6th webinar coming up at the end of June, and I'll give some information about that towards the end of the webinar. So it looks like a couple of you have participated previously, and the rest of you are new to us. So welcome for those of you who are new to our webinars and the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. So I always love to honor the fact that we've had some great sponsors in the past. It just seems like a nice thing to do. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, their Office of Environmental Education, has been a sponsor of this project since the very beginning. And we are currently receiving funding through EPA, the Environmental Education, the National Environmental Education Training Program, which is being called EE Capacity, and it is housed in the Cornell University Civic Ecology Lab. We've also had a number of other partners throughout the years. Some of them have given us funding. Some of them have just been incredibly supportive of our efforts. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, the National Environmental Education Foundation, which is the group that promotes Environmental Education Week every year. We have state-level environmental education associations throughout the United States and provincial associations in Canada, and many of them have been strong partners of this project throughout the years. And then a number of organizational partners, so groups like EDS, EECG, but also the Project Learning Tree, Arbor Day Foundation, Project Wild, Project Wet, Keep America Beautiful. A range of different other organizations have been our partners. Now what we'd like to do is give you a chance to tell us just a little bit about yourselves. It's helpful for us to understand where it is that you practice environmental education. And I understand completely that you may well work in urban and suburban areas or across all three, but if you could just give us a sense of the sort of preponderance. So most of your work takes place in these different places. So it's looking like it's kind of mostly urban with some suburban and a little bit of rural thrown in there. Thank you for that. And one last little opportunity for us to get a sense of who you are. If you could tell us what sort of is the focus of your practice. So do you consider yourself to be a pre-K through 12 classroom teacher or administrator, a non-formal educator, or a college or university educator? And given the focus of this particular webinar on non-formal environmental education, it's not too surprising that the vast majority of you are non-formal educators. We want to get into the guidelines themselves now. The National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education, the whole focus of it is promoting excellence in environmental education. We have developed a series of what we call guidelines. They're all publications that are built off of our collective wisdom as practitioners, all of us out here in the field. We've developed these guidelines through a broad-based participation process So what we've done is, in essence, tried to come up with some ideas around a particular topic, in this case, non-formal environmental education programs. And then once we have those general ideas out there, we send it out for public review, get comments back, revise, send out for review, revise again. And through this process, and in fact the entire project, what we're trying to do is to engage educators of every stripe in a deep discussion about quality environmental education and what that means. And in essence, what we're trying to do and what NAAEE is trying to do is to build environmental education as a profession. As I've mentioned, we have a series of publications called the Guidelines for Excellence. Each focuses on a different topic. Um, there are 5 of these publications. One has to do with materials, instructional materials and how to develop them. One has to do with K through 12 learning and sort of what are what's the knowledge and the skills that people need in order to become environmentally literate. A third one has to do with the preparation and professional development of environmental educators. And the very last one that we developed had to do with early childhood environmental education. But this one, and the focus of this particular webinar, it has to do with non-formal environmental education programs. And what we wanted to do was to get just sort of a sense from you, one last poll, I promise, is how familiar are you with this set of guidelines? So the guidelines for the non-formal environmental education programs. Okay, so thank you very much. Um, it looks like most of you are not particularly familiar with them, which is great. Well, maybe not great that you haven't ever run into them before, but that's exactly the purpose of the webinar, is to start to allow people to understand what these guidelines are about and how they can be used and how they can be accessed. So basically, the non-formal EE programs guidelines has to do with how you can go about developing and administering high-quality environmental education programs. As I said, that they were developed through a broad-based review and comment process. They are divided into what we call key characteristics. These are just big ideas that help organize the set of guidelines. So there are 6 key characteristics of program development and implementation. And what I'm going to do is just run through quickly so you have an overview of the types of things that we're talking about in the guidelines. So the first key characteristic of quality non-formal environmental education programs really revolves around the idea that these programs are designed to address identified environmental, educational, and community needs, and to produce responsive, responsible benefits that address those identified needs. And you do that somewhat by thinking seriously before you even start your program development process about what environmental issue or environmental condition you want to address by looking at the existing sets of programs and materials that are out there. And finally, to really think about who your audience would be and what are their needs for a program, and making sure that you're addressing those kinds of needs. The second key characteristic has you think sort of centered on your own organization or agency. So considering the mission of your organization or agency? Will this new program be consistent with the priorities of that organization? Um, is it an identified need for your organization? And do you have the capacity? Do you have the existing resources available as you take on this new venture? It's the classic types of questions that you want to ask yourself to make sure that there isn't mission creep and that you aren't overextending yourself before you jump into the new venture. The third key characteristic basically asks you to um, think about programs scope and structure. So start to consider, what are your goals? What are your objectives for this program? What is it that you're hoping to accomplish by putting this effort into developing the program and by putting all of that effort into it? Does it fit with the goals and objectives of environmental education, or how does it? So that you want to make sure that you're thinking through where you want to be at the end of the day with this particular program. What's its format and delivery going to be? So is this a one-off kind of program? Is it something that's going to be held every Saturday at your center or at some other setting? And what are the kinds of partnerships and collaborations are possible with this program? And how might you go about developing those so that it's as strong of a program and using resources as well as possible as you move into it? So we continue that theme of looking at resources, is that as you're developing this program, you start to assess, well, what are the resources we're going to need? Are we going to need space? Are we going to need people? Are we going to need volunteers? Do we have a sufficient staff? If we're going to have an instructional staff, whether it's paid or volunteers, how do we go about making sure that they're well qualified and that they're prepared to deliver this particular program? What are all those concerns about facilities? If you're using your own facility, you know it well. But if you're borrowing someone else's facility or using a public facility, what are those kinds of management issues that you might have? Emergency planning, safety, all of those kinds of things. Just making sure that the participants are comfortable, that they have water available and restrooms available, those kinds of things. Then we move into thinking about the actual program itself, the types of materials that you're developing for this program. So thinking about the instructional materials and what types of techniques and you're going to be using, what's your content. Have you field tested them to make sure that they work before you roll it out for 100 community participants on that Saturday morning? How are you going to promote it? How are you going to market this new program? How are you going to disseminate information about it or disseminate the program to a wider audience? And finally, a really important question to start to ask yourself has to do with sustainability. So if this is being funded particularly by soft money, by grant or generous donation, how are you going to sustain this program throughout its lifetime and into the future? And finally, and certainly not at all as an afterthought, evaluation. So how are you going to know whether or not this program actually did what you hoped it would do? What are the evaluation strategies that you're going to use? What are those types of criteria and techniques that you might use to evaluate your program? And what's really, really important is, how are you going to use those evaluation results? So building into your plan the notion that as you develop evaluation, so as you conduct formative evaluation throughout the development of the program and as you start to pilot test your program, how are you going to use those results back to improve the program and how it goes forward into the future? And now what I want to do is turn the webinar over to Bill, who has some information to tell us basically about the project and how he has used it. We're going to have two sort of different case studies in essence, one from Bill and the other one from Ed.
Thank you, Bora. And as Bora has been speaking, I've been following her comments in my 36-page booklet on the Guidelines for Excellence in Non-Formal Programs. And I just want to mention that you can either purchase the booklet from the North American Association, or it's available for free download at their website, or you can get hard copy from EPA as well. And Bora has done a great job of summarizing 36 pages in about 10 minutes. So I'll get into my remarks for perhaps the next 10 or 15 minutes on the guidelines being embraced in an unlikely place, namely the church. And it's been my observation over time that churches really have not been aware of the guidelines for excellence. But yes, as an educator myself, when I got more involved with them a year ago, I saw a real opportunity to bridge the gap between the environmental education community formally and the church, particularly when you think of all the churches you may know about who employ well-trained educators. So there just seemed to be a nice connection to be made. And so with that, let me give you a little bit of context with the next slide. Can I do that, Bor, or do you?
Yeah, you can just use that little gray arrow down at the bottom of your screen to move forward.
Okay.
Yep, perfect.
So what? Just for a little bit of context, I'd like to share with you how communities of faith worldwide are stepping up in Earth stewardship, and some folks suggest that the faith community has been late to the table, but it's making great strides. The first bullet indicates the Alliance of Religions in Conservation, which is an umbrella group for 11 faiths of the world. And it's a wonderful website housed in England, actually, where you could go to find out about many religions. In the United States, most of the major mainline denominations are engaged with Earth stewardship. The Catholic Church has an active program. Methodists, I've gotten material from the Church of Scotland even, so there's a lot of material out there. And then finally, as a scientist, I found it interesting last year when the Ecological Society of America came out with a really important paper talking about 3 partners that they felt scientists need to engage with to address major ecological disruptions on our planet. And they defined the faith community as one of them, actually held focus groups with different denominations to look for common ground where science-based messages could be incorporated in some of the educational programs in the church in non-formal ways or even in some classrooms. So I find that interesting. Okay. So now what I'd like to do is introduce you to a case study for applying environmental education non-formal guidelines. And specifically, I want to focus on the Earth Care Congregations program of the Presbyterian Church USA, which is one of the old mainline denominations with about 2 million members. The Earth Care Congregations program is just about 2 years old, and since that time 80 congregations have been certified. I happen to belong to one here in Montreat, North Carolina, and I'll draw some examples from that in just a couple of slides. Presbyterians are known for doing things decently and in order, and we have a wonderful hard copy book also on the website entitled Earth Care Congregations, A Guide to Greening Presbyterian Churches. And this book has made it so easy for congregations to sort of do an audit in terms of their aspects of their worship, their educational programs, their outreach, and even their facilities to look at energy conservation practices, for example, as well as greening up sermons or having classes or field trips or community service projects. So I've got the website there for you to get to that. And the last thing I'd say about the Presbyterian program as I was getting ready for this presentation is that in terms of quality control, the Presbyterian Church employs a lot of highly educated people. So I think that as the guidelines for excellence get better known, I think we'll see people sort of embracing some of the guidelines or all of them. Let me talk about the methodology now of what I did. I went to my very first NAAE meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina last fall, and at that time our church had been certified as an Earth Care congregation, so we had some achievements to report, and I wanted to sort of marry the performance of the church with the guidelines from the NAAE. So like any good scientist, perhaps, I made a table. And the table consisted of the 6 characteristics that Bora has already mentioned. And in my following slides, I'm going to list those characteristics. And then under each of the characteristics, there are between 3 and 4 or 5 so-called specific actions that one can look at. And then under those actions, there are more than 100 indicators. So it really took some effort to put together a table, and I wound up looking at 65 of the indicators. Some of them talk about emergency preparedness on field trips, and they clearly weren't applicable to our congregation at that time. So again, after the roundtable meeting in Raleigh, Bora invited me to submit the paper that I wrote, including the table, to the website that you see on the slide. So now let me go to I've got a series of 3 slides to share with you on our experience. And what I'd like to do is sort of match the excellence guidelines with the performance of both my local congregation and the National Church's Environmental Ministries Office in terms of how their whole protocol works. So to begin then, with the key characteristic dealing with needs assessment, number 1 on the slide, I've got one example. And when you look at the document produced by NAAE, and I'm just learning how to say that acronym, there's a specific action called 1.1, and it addresses how you confirm the need. Bora mentioned needs assessment. and in the hierarchy of our church, I saw that the denomination headquarters had already developed a plan of action for developing Earth Care congregations. So it gave it some structure. And then within our local church, we had an environment committee. We call it the Earth Ministry Team. And then also within our church, the governing body called the session embraced the whole process. So we had sort of some sign-off at different levels, and we had some framework for proceeding. But the national denomination had clearly identified. Excuse me, my wife is bringing me a glass of water here for my hoarse throat. I've had a cold all weekend, so excuse me. So we had a strong needs assessment. The second action dealt with or characteristic dealt with organizational needs and capacities. And here we addressed specific action 2.1, the goals and priorities of the parent organization. And amazingly, in 1990, the governing body of the Presbyterian Church adopted a document called Restoring Creation for Ecology and Justice. They addressed 5 major concerns with Earth stewardship, and then, of course, they they tied it to biblical references and came up with very strong statements of how the church needed to get to the grassroots to respond to some of these issues. And fast forward then to 2010 when the Earth Care Congregations Guidebook came out. And I should mention, on behalf of the National Presbyterian Church, that they've got a real good repository of videos and printed lesson plans dealing with restoring creation. So there are other resources available. I'm only trying to give you one example in the limited time that we have. A third key characteristic I'd like to describe to you is the program scope and structure. And here I've got two examples. One was 3.2, the overall fit with environmental education. And a good example comes to mind. Last summer, we organized an outing for our church to Asheville, North Carolina, 15 miles away, to see a movie on a Sunday afternoon. And the movie was called The Last Mountain. And it's about mountaintop removal for coal mining, which is a big issue in our area of the Appalachian Mountains. And as we viewed the movie, and then as we held two follow-up discussion groups to sort of process what we had seen, we went through those so-called four strands of education, where we had questioning of the issues, we built knowledge, we developed skills to deal with the issue, and we talked about our responsibilities. So one of the members of our group, for example, then volunteered to get information on energy conservation programs that we could share with the whole congregation. Meanwhile, another of the actions, 3.4, deals with partnerships. And recently, the EPA Energy Star Congregations Program invited the Presbyterian Church to partner in a national webinar dealing with energy conservation. So again, building those partnerships is very important. The fourth key characteristic I'd mention on program delivery resources has to deal with training. And I just put attend NAAE national conferences ! Because the training I received last October was just fabulous. And if you're not able to get to the national meeting, which Bora will advertise later this afternoon, your state chapter might be a really fine place to learn more about these resources and network with people who have applied them already. Finally, the last two characteristics, one dealt with program quality and appropriateness, and in terms of what the guidelines call pedagogic soundness and staffing, I looked at our own church program, and our adult education committee is comprised of a former school board member elected, a master's degree level director of Christian education, 2 classroom teachers, and a Girl Scout leader. So need I say more about the soundness of our materials? And then finally, in terms of evaluation, at first in my analysis, I thought that our congregations program might be the weak link, but as it turned out, that was not the case. And a couple of examples I'll give you. One of the indicators is that are the results used. And we had a congregational community potluck supper last year with a program on recycling. And the lady circled in yellow there is our garbage fairy, now promoted to recycling fairy. And she gave a marvelous presentation on sort of the do's and don'ts of recycling. And we had people leaving the meeting looking me in the eye and saying, every time they look at trash, they feel guilty now. So I think that was an indicator of success. And then the last thing is that the local township here has what's called the Land Care Committee. It's sort of chartered by the state, and our Earth Ministry team has been invited as a member, I think because of the effectiveness of some of the programming. So finally, to conclude with a half a dozen lessons and benefits, when I looked at 65 of the indicators from the Guidelines for Excellence, I found that 94% were fulfilled by our Earth Care Congregations program, both at the local level and at the national level. So that sort of surprised me. but it was a good surprise. Um, I have to say on bullet number 2 that we only used the guidelines in hindsight, so better late than never, but it sort of reinforced that we were on the right track with our program. However, it let us spot some gaps and revise our practices for improvements, as the guidelines say. But now that we've had such a good experience at the front end of future programming, to me, the guidelines are right beside me as I'm developing our next plan of work. Um, Finally, the guidelines have provided the church, I would say, with a broader engagement with environmental literacy, and having access to the association's resources is proving to be very valuable. And then, as I mentioned, with the town and professional societies, it's provided entree for our congregation to get involved with community entities, whether they're nonprofit and governmental or possibly businesses. And then just a final word of thanks. It's been a real morale booster, I think, to sort of have the support of Bora and Ed and others concerned with developing the guidelines. And our hope is that the churches will continue to embrace a very valuable set of guidelines. So thank you, Bora and Ed.
You're welcome. And now I think what I'm going to do is turn it over to Ed, and he has some additional information about the guidelines and how they can be used.
As you can see from the screen, I'd like to talk about the evaluation component of the non-formal guidelines. And you can use, as Bill said, you can use the guidelines to help you develop a program. And there are really good things in the guidelines themselves to help you build in evaluation techniques, set goals. There is a very good several things in the appendices that talk about how to set the goals, how to write objectives, a logic model. And those can be very helpful as you're developing your program if it's a new program. But if you have an existing program, it's also very helpful to use the guidelines in a variety of ways to take a look at that program and see how it can be improved. One of the ways you can do that is through a self-evaluation of the program by you and the staff of the organization you work with. Another way is to use the guidelines, have them used by an outside evaluator who comes in to evaluate the program. And I'm going to talk about both of those for a few minutes. Self-evaluation by the staff, I think, is a really excellent way to go to take a fresh look at an existing program. It has a lot of pros to this approach. It involves the people who know the most about the program. It allows the staff to really think through what a good program actually is as they work through the evaluation process. And by using the guidelines and what the guidelines say are good programs, it's less arbitrary. It isn't somebody telling them or the boss telling them that this is what the good program is. By working through and using the written guidelines that have been developed through a critique and consensus process, as Bora mentioned, they can feel reassured that they are comparing their program to characteristics that are really important. It does tend to help the staff to get better involved with each other to discuss these important issues and to really consider different opinions and different ways of looking at the evaluation process. Built into the evaluation system is the idea that once you find things that need improvement, you can work as the staff, as a group, or as subcommittees, however you want to break this up, but to begin to look at improvements and figure out how you can implement them. By using a self-evaluation technique, there's less pressure on the staff, less sense of a top-down gotcha, you're doing this wrong, bad boy, bad girl type thing. And because, as I said, you have the guidelines themselves to fall back on, you can use that to improve your program at the same time that you can feel confident that the evaluation process you've gone through is based on solid, sound research and information, best practices in the field. Self-evaluation isn't all positive, perhaps. People tend to think their programs are really good, or they wouldn't be doing them that way. So sometimes it's difficult to get the staff to really admit that there are problems or to take a look at the details closely enough to find areas where improvements are possible. It also, this technique requires a motivated and staff that's really willing to get into this. If the staff is defensive, if they really don't think this type of evaluation is worthwhile, it's going to be very difficult to implement, to use these guidelines for self-evaluation. And it also requires that the staff have a pretty good foundation in things like setting objectives and objective-based program activities. If they don't, for instance, it probably would be wise to start with some work on setting objectives and relating to their overall existing program before you try to get in and do this self-evaluation. But by and large, self-evaluation, if the staff is interested, if the staff is agreeable to giving it a serious work through, is a really good way to make improvements, and not just make improvements, but make the most serious, most needed improvements and figure out ways to implement the improvements that are necessary. You can also use these guidelines and have an independent evaluator come in from the outside. By using the guidelines, it provides a background for the evaluation so that it doesn't appear arbitrary. If an outside person comes in and starts saying you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, people intend to get defensive. They figure that their opinion is just as good as the guy or the person that's saying it. So the rationale based on the guidelines is a good way for the outside evaluator to establish credentials. You have most of the input coming from the outside evaluator, but the staff can follow up on the evaluation recommendations by going back to the guidelines and getting more details and looking more seriously about the recommendations that the evaluator might make. Also, by using the guidelines, the evaluator can convince management that they're using a valid yardstick and that it won't be, again, an arbitrary process just linked to the evaluator person, him or herself. The cons for using an outside evaluator are really mostly related to the fact you're using an outside evaluator instead of working internally with the staff, rather than problems with the guidelines themselves. You can create a very top-down sense of they're bringing in the experts to show us how bad a job we're doing. If the outside evaluator isn't skilled and doesn't go about it right, it can get to be a very negative situation. With an outside evaluator, the staff is less likely to be thoroughly involved in the process and less likely to support the outcome because of that. They don't tend to know as much about why the recommendations for change were made, and again, that means they're less likely to actually support the changes, particularly if it's in a program they've done and they've known and they have developed themselves. There's a lot of resistance to change. If they work through the process internally with the other staff members, they have a sense that they've accomplished something or that they are the ones coming up with the recommendations. An outside evaluator can, as I've mentioned, just seem like it's a very top-down situation and less likely to build support for the changes. There is a self-assessment tool. And don't worry if you have trouble seeing this. It isn't intended, I don't intend to go over it, but just to tell you, go over it in detail. Just to tell you that there is this tool, and it does take the key characteristics the 6 key characteristics, and then gets down to the next level, the guidelines for each one. And if you use this with staff, they can go through and mark whether they never meet that guideline, sometimes, most of the time, or always. And it's a very simple, not particularly accurate, but a good background way to get into the evaluation. You can then have them group how they did, provide a more visual representation of where the strengths and weaknesses of the program are. And then you get to the actual area of, okay, we've identified a lot of strengths. We're going to continue those. How can we promote these more thoroughly throughout the programs? What are we doing right, and how can we expand it? Then we also have a summary of the things the staff think that they need to improve, and that's a good plan, good way to start a work plan, which can be used then to make changes that are needed. And that's what I'd like to say about using the guidelines for evaluation. I've done a little work on both training people to use the guidelines for evaluation and also with staff. I just would encourage the internal staff-driven method if at all possible, but I also would strongly caution that staff has to be agreeable and see this as a beneficial thing to be done. Bora?
Great. Thank you very much, Ed. So basically both Bill and Ed have provided a couple of snapshots of different ways that you can use the guidelines for your own program development and improvement. What I'd like to let you know is that there are other opportunities if you'd like to learn more about this set of guidelines or any of the other sets of guidelines. We have something called the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, and basically that's just a fancy term for saying we have a number of people across the country who are facilitators, who are able to run a workshop, a half-day, full-day workshop on any one of these sets of guidelines and basically help you, your staff, and others in your area think through your programs and learn more about the guidelines and how you can use them in your own program development and implementation. One of the really nice things is that right now, because we have funding from EPA, we are able to pay for the travel of a facilitator to be able to come to a place and offer a workshop. Typically we want an audience of somewhere around 20 to 30 people, and we're also able to offer the books for free for a workshop. So that's just an opportunity. If you think you might be interested in that, please contact me and I'll be able to connect you in with one of the members of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. Just as an example, Ed is one of our facilitators. You can also access the guidelines, all of them, the non-formal guidelines, that self-assessment tool that Ed was talking about, all are available up on EE Linked. So it's eelinked.net/n/guidelines. And I'm going to show you a sample page from that in just a second. Or you can attend another one of the webinars, or also go up to the EE Linked website, and there is a listing of all of the webinars that we have held with a URL that you can click on to go to a recording of that webinar. So that's something that's available to you and anyone else. So we have EE Linked. It's for NAAEE. It's basically a site that allows for posting of all sorts of different information. And this happens to be the Guidelines for Excellence Network up on EE Link. And you can see over here on the left-hand side where it says filter by topic. If this was a live link, you could click on National Project for Excellence, and there would be different postings that would provide information about the project itself, There's postings that have to do with the EE materials guidelines, the K-12 guidelines, the preparation and professional development. So for each one of the sets of guidelines, as well as that listing about the webinars and where you can access them. Here's the page, just a snapshot from the for the non-formal guidelines. And one thing that I wanted to point out to all of you is that the guidelines are all posted here in PDF. So you can go up any time of day, go up to EE Linked and click on the PDF symbol and basically download a copy of the guidelines for free. This is also where we have that a self-assessment tool is posted. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to people also was that this set of guidelines, the non-formal guidelines, as well as our instructional materials guidelines, have both been translated into Spanish. So if you work with staff members or volunteers who are more comfortable using the Spanish language, these sets of guidelines might be useful for you. And that's just that EE linked URL one more time so that you can find it. And then a mention that we do have a future webinar coming up at the end of June. It's going to be focusing on the early childhood EE programs, guidelines for excellence. And basically, if you go to the, you can register up on SurveyMonkey again as you did for this particular webinar, and you'll receive the information of how to actually join into the webinar. One of the things I wanted to mention is that we have the 5 sets of guidelines already published, but we are in the process of developing a sixth set of guidelines. That's hard to say fast. That's going to focus on community environmental education. And Akima Price is leading that initiative, and I'm helping her with it. So if you think that you might want to be involved, you might want to be able to see drafts of the guidelines as we develop them, please give Akima a holler at her email address. It's just Akima at apriceconsulting.com. And then you can get on the list to see the drafts as they're developed and be able to comment. We'll also be posting them up on the EE Linked website and through NAAEE and other places. So what I want to do is just open it up for questions. I'm going to click to one final slide so it's up there in front of you that we do have a conference coming up in the fall in October. It's going to be in Oakland, California, October 10th through the 13th. The NAAEE conference, and there will be a number of different sessions that focus on the guidelines, a half-day workshop that's going to focus on early childhood, as well as lots and lots of other great things at the conference. So I invite you all to attend the conference. It's a wonderful conference. So if you have a question for any one of us or a comment, if you would like to type them into the chat function, we'd be happy to answer them. I'll just pause for a moment here while you think about those questions and whether or not you have any. A little wait time. It looks like someone is typing in. And just as we're waiting for the chats to come up, I wanted to mention that just once again that I will be emailing each of you or each of the people who pre-registered for this through SurveyMonkey about how to access the recording of this. Uh, but if you go to that EE linked website, it'll also be posted there. So Joellen has asked a question. A table was mentioned to help with the evaluation. Is this available or do we create it ourselves? I think you were, oh, um, I think that's referring back to Bill, and that Bill had sort of created his own, um, looking at each of the key characteristics and looking at each of the guidelines, and then the the guidelines are set up so that there's key characteristics, those 6 big key characteristics like needs assessment and such, and then it has guidelines, and then it actually goes further to have what are called indicators, and these are just suggested things that you might see in a program if it was meeting that guideline or meeting that key characteristic. And I think what Bill did was he sort of created a giant, I think you said 36 page, but it was a very long table that he was able to do kind of an evaluation of looking at his program against the guidelines. And he did this himself. There is the little table that Ed presented of the self-evaluation, and that is available up on the web for you to be able to just go through and do checks and such. But it doesn't go down to that next level, the indicator level. It just has the key characteristic and the guideline. Bill, did you have anything to add?
Well, fortunately, the table was just 6 pages long.
Oh, good. Now
I
I
did,
expanded it just a little bit, huh?
yeah, I did create it myself, and it's on the EE linked site if anybody would like to access it. If you want to give them that email address again, Bora.
I can do that. I will go back to that slide. But yes, if you go up to EE linked, and actually, let me see. This is, I think, yeah, I think it might be the next slide of yours. Yep, we'll see.
Maybe let's go back about 3 or 4 slides.
Okay, back about, let's try to see. There we go. Nope, that's not it.
No,
Sorry about
next.
this jumping around, folks. There it is. So that URL there that is in orange. But if you just go to EE linked and to the guidelines network, then under the topics, if you look under, there's a topic that has to do with how other people have used the guidelines. I believe Bill's piece is posted there. It may also well be posted under the non-formal, but if you follow that longer URL, you would be able to get to it directly.
And,
And thank you, Bill, because I'd forgotten that you actually posted the table that you used.
and Bora, on that posting is my email address, and I'm more than glad to, share my experience with anyone. The guidelines are so user friendly. It made the work very, very, very easy.
Thank you for that. Any other questions from people? Ah, great. And thank you, Joellen, for mentioning that as a question. Well, it looks like we are coming to the close of the session. And if you do have further questions, please either contact Bill or Ed directly or myself. And we'd be more than happy to help you think about how you could use the guidelines or access the various materials. I would very much like to thank Bill and Ed for all of their time and their energy in putting together this webinar. It's always great to work with colleagues across the country and be able to share the types of work that folks are doing. So I'd like to thank you all very much for attending and enjoy the rest of your day. I know we've got a wonderful spring day here in Eugene. Somebody was just asking, will review links and listen to recording to be sure. That just saying that you will be reviewing the links and listening to sure that they got it all. So yes, the one of the things we don't know how long the recordings will be posted because it's through Cornell University, and we just really don't know how long they'll be archived. But please do listen to them in again if that's helpful for you, or share those links with colleagues. So our hope is that it will be useful to folks. So thank you all very much for attending our webinar, and hope to see you at the NAAE conference in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Bora and Ed. Goodbye.
Bye.